Hello everyone, welcome back to Triad Travelogues. I am Richard, coming at you today from the outskirts of Shanghai, China, to talk to you a little bit about reverse culture shock. That is what it's like to return home after spending a long period of time abroad. Now, I've been thinking about this recently because my wife and I have been kind of in the final stages of her immigration paperwork, so she can eventually immigrate to the United States of America, where I am from. So we're, as long as our immigration paperwork is accepted, we will be going to the United States within the next year, probably. My wife is from China, and I've been thinking about what it's gonna be like for me to return back to the US, because I've been in China for 4 years and I've been traveling for 5 years. Actually, today is August 18th, which marks the 5-year anniversary of when I started traveling internationally. I left for Kathmandu, Nepal. I got on an airplane from Dallas on the 18th of August, 5 years ago. So I've been thinking about what it's gonna be like for me to return, and even what it's gonna be like for my wife to live in a brand new place, a place that she's only spent a couple of months in throughout her whole life. And I thought it would make a good video to talk about reverse culture shock, what it's like to go back home after you spend a long time traveling. Now, I spent the better part of 1 year in Nepal. I spent some time in Kathmandu, I spent some time backpacking around Nepal. I spent some time in Lumbini in West Nepal, which was the birthplace of the Buddha. And after that time, before I came to China, I spent a few months living with my parents close to Dallas. So I went back to Dallas before I came to China. So I'm gonna relate to you what my experience was returning back to my home country and kind of what that was like. Now, people talk about reverse culture shock, and I think normally what people mean is kind of what it's like to have to become reacclimated to the things in your original environment that you were used to. Because when you go to a new place, especially when you go to a new country that is very unlike your first country, well, your home country, there are a lot of things that you have to get used to that you really just don't ever think about, because they're things that you just take for granted. The smells, the sounds, the way that food tastes, the accessibility of goods, the accessibility of food, the way that people interact with one another, the language, the culture. I mean, it's everything. And I have another video on this channel about dealing with culture shock. But reverse culture shock is like the opposite, you know? You spend a year in a new place, and I think a year is enough time for you to really start, not necessarily acclimating or assimilating, but for you to at least get used to all of the things that I mentioned that are specific to that environment. So, you know, toward the end of my stay in Nepal, I think I was not used to those things, but at least I had accepted them as being normal. They were my new reality. So when I returned back to the United States, it was like I had to get reacclimated to the original things that I mistook as being reality. That's what most people think about, I guess, when they think about, if they think about reverse culture shock. Now, when I came back from Nepal, I landed in Houston, the Houston airport, before I went to DFW. My parents picked me up from DFW. And the very first thing I noticed when I got off of the plane was how unbelievably fat that everybody was. Like, in Nepal, fat people are few and far between. It's not just because maybe they eat less or they have less access to food. It's not because of poverty. I mean, it's not just because of poverty. Poverty plays a role in that. But people are just, I think, naturally more thin in this part of the world. China too. You know, there are fat people, but you see them a lot less. But man, in Houston, like, everybody's so fat. They're just fat. There's fat people everywhere. The very first thing I noticed, man, and then, you know, I noticed, like, wow, the airport in Houston is clean. It's so clean. Like, the floors are clean, and it smells clean. You know, like, there's this kind of putrid trash smell everywhere in Nepal. And I love Nepal. I'm not talking down on Nepal. I love Nepal. But it smells really bad, and it's really dirty, and like everywhere. There's trash everywhere. So those are the first things I noticed. The, you know, better smells, fatter people, and everything was clean. And you know, my parents picked me up, and I spent a few weeks kind of getting used to just being back home. A lot of people, I've read online, a lot of people tend to get sick when they return home because they have their gut bacteria changes again, so they have to get used to eating the food that they ate originally. Because when I first got to Nepal, I spent the first month just sick, like diarrhea and vomiting and all sorts of sick. I actually spent most of my time there pretty sick, but the first month I was really sick. And I finally got used to the food and the water and everything. And when I returned back home, I expected, from what I read online, I expected to get sick again, because I had to get reacclimated to eating, you know, Western food again, or eating food in the US. Much different health and safety standards in the States than in Nepal. But actually, it was not a problem. I never got sick. I was able to just reacclimate to the food without a problem. I do remember the very first time I went out to eat with my friend. She took me to this restaurant because I was like, I really want nachos. So she took me to this restaurant and I got a plate of nachos. And I look at the menu and the nachos are $20. 20 US dollars. And I was like, oh my God, $20 for a plate of nachos? Because in Nepal, I could eat a huge plate of food for like 30 cents. And I would never spend more than a couple of dollars. Like $2 on a meal would be living like a king where I was in Fatung, Kathmandu. I'm sorry about the coughing. I live in Shanghai and the air is filthy, so I cough a lot. It's not very attractive, I know. So that was another thing that was like, holy, the food is so expensive here, you know, and so wasteful. Like, you'll see people leaving after they're finished with their meal, and there's a whole table full of food. And you don't see that in Nepal. People finish their food. It's considered very rude not to finish your food. So at the end of a meal, the table is empty. There's no food left, you know, in a place where some people don't have access to food. Some people eat rice every day. Some people don't even have rice. In a place with a lot of poverty, it's not common to see food wasted. But I was shocked because I had never really thought about how much food was wasted in the States. Now I'm in China and food wasting is like an Olympic sport here. People intentionally waste food in China because it makes them look like rich. Like, it's the aesthetic of, oh look, I have so much money I can just waste a whole table full of food. Like, that's common here. So that's actually more common in China than it is in the States, where people just do it because they're full. Anyway, so, you know, I didn't really have much of a problem reacclimating to those things. Like the prices of stuff, the accessibility of stuff. It was cool that I could get in my car and drive to the grocery store. Now, at the time, I didn't plan on coming to China, but I was bored in the States. I didn't have a job. I didn't really want to like be stable at that point. It was before I met my wife and had a baby. So eventually I decided that it was boring for me. I wanted to travel more, have more adventures, so I left the States, came to China, and started working in ESL here because I was out of money at the time. Now, the thing about reverse culture shock, other than the things I mentioned, which I guess were easy for me compared to what I've heard from other people, the thing that I never thought about, the hardest part about it for me, was realizing that I was no longer on the same trajectory as my circle of friends and my family to some extent. Because, you know, I grew up in Texas. I spent my, 20 plus years in Texas. I spent some time on the East Coast before I started traveling. But a lot of my old childhood friends are in Texas. And when you have a group of friends for a long period of time, even though everybody does their own thing and they have their own interests, and you all have this kind of commonality in that you're all sort of moving in the same direction. You're all kind of on that same trajectory, and it always moves. It's always moving, you know? And so when you spend so much time with a group of people and you're all in this sort of trajectory, you don't really ever think about it. It's just, you just sort of move together. You just sort of kind of experience life together. And everyone, like I said, they go in different directions, but at the end of the day, everyone's still on that kind of trajectory. Now, when you leave, not for a vacation, but when you leave for long-term travel and you sever your, you know, your ties in terms of like jobs and relationships, like I was engaged and I severed my relationship. When you make that decision to leave everything behind and go travel, even if you plan to come back, that sort of trajectory that you're on with your friends, it keeps going, but without you. So you're not in that trajectory anymore. So it's like you leave and maybe your friends are sad and maybe they think about you sometimes. But ultimately, it's like when you die, it's the same. People are sad or whatever, but that trajectory continues. That's a natural process of movement and it keeps going. And when you're traveling, especially when you go to a totally different place, you're having different emotional experiences. You're in a different place physically. In terms of even things like career and interests and art, like you're going in a different direction. And if you're alone traveling, it's like you're on your sort of own trajectory. And you don't ever really escape from that new trajectory. I mean, you can change directions, but it's like when you leave, you're kind of by yourself from that point on. And when you return back home, things are different. It's not, you know, it's not because people don't care. Like you can sit down and talk to your friends, from my experience, about your travel and about your adventures, and they'll be nice and kind and listen, but they don't really understand because you've gone through so much change on your own trajectory, and your friends have gone through their change on their trajectory, and you're never gonna meet in the middle again. You're never gonna be able to sort of coincide again in that trajectory. You can never go back home. I don't want to sound, it's not a negative thing, it's just the truth. When you leave for a long time, and especially if you leave on like a you know, if you want enlightenment and you leave for the purpose of spiritual enlightenment and you actually attain something along those lines, you can never go back home. You can go back home physically, but it's never going to be the same. And that's that's something you have to deal with. That's the biggest part of the reverse culture shock that I experienced, is that I kind of was alone still. Like I don't mind being alone, and I left the States to travel alone, and ultimately I wanted to be alone. But it was weird going back home and being with the people that I spent my whole childhood with and still kind of feeling alone. It was kind of sad, I guess. Maybe it was part of the reason that I decided to leave again, because I realized you know, things were never gonna be the same. So yeah, what else? I guess that's really all I have to say about reverse culture shock. I was really depressed in the months that I was spending with my parents, because I guess when I had, okay, people just love to stop and go and just like stare at me. I hate it. What was I saying? Yeah, I was depressed for the whole time I was living with my parents, because to me, when I first went to Nepal, I was on a quest, I was on a mission. I was very idealistic at that time, and I thought I was gonna save the world. I was gonna go and help all these kids at the orphanage, and you know, I was gonna make the world a better place. And I returned home deflated and sort of disenfranchised from just all of humanity, cynical, negative. I did not have a bad experience in Nepal, but it was way different than I thought that it would be, and it humbled me a lot. It made me realize how flawed that some of my philosophies were. And in coming back home, I sort of was forced to deal with the fact that Nepal was not the end. I always thought I was going to embark on this spiritual journey, and I was going to emerge a different person, and everything was going to change. And I did emerge a different person, but things didn't change the way I wanted them to. I still had to deal with reality. I still had to deal with work. I still had to deal with like deciding what I was going to do with my life. There were all these things that, I don't know, I was just so idealistic. I guess I thought, I'm gonna give my life for this journey, you know? I'm gonna go to Nepal, and I did not ever see past that point. So when I returned home, it was like, man, now I gotta deal with reality again. And it's not the same reality I left, but it looks a hell of a lot like the one I left. And I'm also burdened with all these new questions. The thing is, when you go, and you try to enlighten yourself, and you get some semblance of enlightenment, it's kind of like a scientific experiment. Science experiments might answer a couple of questions, but for every question that's answered, there's this huge world of new questions that emerge. And that's what I had to realize the hard way, is that some of my questions may have been answered, and I fought some of my demons, and I won some kind of battle, but at the end of the day, it just opened up this world of new questions. And I realized at that point, I'm gonna be searching for the rest of my life for something that I'm not even aware, I don't even know what it is that I'm looking for, but I'm probably gonna be searching forever for it, and I might not ever find it. Because maybe there's no destination at all. Maybe it's just like, I know it's really cliche, but maybe it's just the journey, you know? I hate to sound like that person. I'm not trying to do like a motivational speech or anything. That was my experience returning home after a long period of time abroad. The next time I return home, I'm gonna return home with a wife and a kid. So it's gonna be a lot different, but we'll see what happens at that point. I think the reverse culture shock is gonna be a lot different because I've been gone for a lot longer. Anyway, I gotta go work now. It's Saturday morning. I really appreciate you guys watching my channel. Please subscribe if you have not already done so. Leave a nice comment in the comment section. Give the video a big thumbs up. Tell your friends and family and your dog, if your dog has a YouTube account. Your dog can subscribe to my channel too. Thank you for watching Triad Travelogues. I am Richard. I will see you next time.